Eighth, though the manner also be inculpable, yet if the principle and motive of killing, even those that deserve to die, be out of malice, hatred, rage, or revenge for private or personal injuries, it is murder. For the affection and intention doth make one and the same action of taking away the life homicide or no homicide. Lex Rex saith, question 31, page 383, if a man out of hatred deliberately take away another man's life, he is insofar a murderer. But if that same man had taken away the other's life by the flying off of his axe head, he neither hating him before nor intending to hurt him, he is no murderer by God's express law, allowing cities of refuge for the one and not for the other. Deuteronomy 4, verse 42, and Deuteronomy 29, verse 4, etc. Private revenge is indignity to God. Whose it is to take vengeance. Deuteronomy 32, verse 35, and Romans 12, verse 19, quote, Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, for vengeance is the Lord's, unquote. For which cause Jacob curses Simeon and Levi, their murder of the Shechemites, for in their anger they slew a man. Genesis 49, verses 6 and 7. So David would not put forth his hand against Saul for his own private and personal quarrel. So Joab killed Abner, and Absalom Ammon. But this doth not make the execution of judgment out of a zeal for God, respect to righteousness, love to the nation's interest, and care to preserve the persecuted people of God from imminent destruction upon public enemies and incendiaries that are trampling upon all these precious interests, and threatening the utter ruin of them, and in a particular manner their destruction, who thus prevent them. Ninth, though the motive or cause were upon a public account, yet it may be murder to have a wrong end in it, as either to intend simply the destruction of the person on whom they execute judgment, as the end to which all their action is directed, or to make their own advantage or honor the end of the action. Thus David would not kill Saul, because it might have been thought he did it to obtain the kingdom, of which he was rightful successor, and deservedly he punished the Amalekite that brought news of the killing of Saul, and Baanah and Rechab for their killing Ishbosheth, thinking thereby to advance themselves at David's court. So also Joab murdered Amasa to secure himself in the general's place. And Jehu, though upon the matter he executed righteous judgment, his end was only himself, it is condemned as murder. But when the execution of righteous judgment is both formally intended by the actors and natively and really doth conduce to the glory of God, the preservation of the remnant threatened to be destroyed by these murderers, the suppressing of impiety, doing of justice, turning away wrath, and removing of present and preventing of future judgments, then it may be duty. Naphtali, page 23, first edition. 10th, though the end also were not culpable, yet it may be murder to kill criminals by transgressing the sphere of our vocation, and usurping upon the magistrate's sword. For he, by office, is a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Romans 13, verse 4. None must make use of the sword of vindictive justice, but he to whom the Lord giveth it. Therefore they that came to take Christ are condemned and threatened for this. Matthew 26, verse 52. Quote, And they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Unquote. The God of order hath assigned to every man his station and calling, within the bounds whereof he should keep, without transgressing by defect or excess. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 20. And study to be quiet and do his own business. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 11. Therefore David would not kill Saul, because he would have done it beside his calling. And therefore the killing of Joash and Ammon was murder, because the assassins did transgress their vocation. But when notorious incendiaries did not only transgress their vocation, but the limits of human society, and turn open enemies to God and man, destroying the innocent, making havoc of the Lord's heritage, and vaunting their villainies, and boasting of their wickednesses, and thereby bringing wrath upon the land, if such effronteries of insolence should pass unpunished, and when there is no magistrate to do that work of justice, but all in that place are art and part with them, patrons and defenders of them, yea, no magistrate that can be acknowledged as a minister of God to be applied unto. In that case, it is not a transgression of our vocation, nor an usurpation upon the magistrates, where there is none, to endeavor to avert wrath by executing righteous judgment. Otherwise, if for fear or suspicion of the accidental hazard of private men's usurping the office, or doing of the duty of public persons, every virtuous action which may be abused shall be utterly neglected. Impiety shall quickly gain universal empire, to the extermination of all goodness. Naphtali, page 24, first edition. To clear this, it must be considered that a man's calling is twofold: his particular calling, whereunto in the ordinary course of things he is regularly confined, and his general calling, not circumscribed by particular rules, which from the common obligation of the end for which all callings are institute, in the clear exigence of an extraordinary emergent, according to the general rules of righteousness, bind to an agreeable practice. Therefore circumstances may sometimes so diversify actions, that what in the ordinary and undisturbed state of things would be accounted in excess of our particular calling and in usurpation, in an extraordinary occurrence may become a necessary duty of our general calling. 11th. Though it were no usurpation beyond our calling, yet it may be murder to kill any without the call of God, in a case of necessity, either in the immediate defense of life, or, though it be in the remote, when the hazard is unavoidable. Everything must have God's calling in its season to make it duty, so also the time of killing. Ecclesiastes 3, verse 3. For want of this, David would not kill Saul. Lex Rex saith excellently to this. Question 31, pages 329 and 330, quote, David might have killed Saul when he was sleeping, and when he cut off the lap of his garment. But it was unlawful for him to kill the Lord's anointed, as it is unlawful to kill a man because he is the image of God. Genesis 9, verse 6, except in case of necessity. David, having Saul in his hand, was in a remote posture of defense. The unjust invasion, then, was not actual nor unavoidable, nor a necessary mean in human prudence for self-preservation. For King Saul was not in actual pursuit of the whole princes, elders, community of Israel. Saul did but seek the life of one man, David, and that not for religion or a national pretended offense, and therefore he could not in conscience put hands on the Lord's anointed. But if Saul had actually invaded David for his life, David might, in that case, make use of Goliath's sword, for he took not that weapon as a cipher to boast Saul, and rather kill than be killed, unquote. Thus he, by a call here, we do not mean an express or immediate call from God, such as the prophets might have to their extraordinary executions of judgment, as Samuel and Elijah to kill Agag and Baal's prophets, but either the allowance of man, then there is no question about it, or if that cannot be had, as is the case circumstantiate, it cannot, then the providential and moral call of extreme necessity for preservation of our lives and preventing the murder of our brethren may warrant an extraordinary execution of righteous judgment upon the murderers. Men may have a call to a necessary duty, neither every way immediate nor immediate, as the call of running together to quench a fire in a city, when magistrates through wickedness or negligence will not or do not call people forth unto that work. They have not man's call nor an immediate call from heaven, yet they have a lawful call from God. So they do not intrude upon the magistrate's office, nor want they a call to this execution of judgment, who did materially that work for that exigent which magistrates by office were bound to do, being called thereto by God, by nature, and the call of inevitable necessity, which knoweth no human law, and to which some divine positive laws will cede. Just Populi, chapter 20, page 423. 12th. Though this be a principle of reason and natural justice, when all the forementioned circumstances are clear, that it is lawful for private persons to execute righteous judgment upon notorious incendiaries and murdering public enemies, in cases of necessity, yet it might be a sinful breach of the sixth command to draw extraordinary examples of it to an ordinary practice in killing all who might be found criminal, and would deserve death by the law, as all that have served under a banner of tyranny and violence, displayed against God and his people, to the ruin of the Reformation, wasting of the country, oppression of many honest families, and destruction of many innocent people, are and would be found guilty of murder, as the chief captain would have truly alleged Paul to have been a murderer if he had been the Egyptian, which had made an uproar and led out 4,000 men that were murderers. Acts 21, verse 58. As for the vulgar and ordinary sort of those vermin of varlets, it is of no advantage for oppressed people to foul their fingers upon them, when their slaughter would not put a stop to, but rather increase the destruction of the people of God, and were unlawful to prevent and anticipate the due and legal execution of judgment, where there is any prospect or expectation of its running in its right channel. But for the chief and principal ringleaders, and common, public, and habitual incendiaries, and masters of the trade of murdering the Lord's people, when there is no other way of being rid of their rage and preserving ourselves, and preventing the destruction of our brethren, we may in that case of necessity make public examples of them in an extraordinary procedure against them. That may be most answerable to the rules of the ordinary procedure of justice, and in imitation of the heroic actions recorded and justified in the Word of God, in the like extraordinary cases, which are imitable when the matter of their actions is ordinary, that is, neither preternatural or supernatural, though the occasion was singular, just, and necessary, both by divine precept and as a mean to good and necessary ends, and when there is no other to do the work, nor any prospect of access to justice in its ordinary and orderly course, nor possibility of suspending it till that can be obtained. We need not then any other call than a spirit of holy zeal for God and for our own and our brethren's preservation in that pinch of extremity. We do not hold these extraordinary actions for regular and ordinary precedents for all times and persons universally, which if people should fancy and heed more the glory and fame of the action than the sound and solid rule of the Scriptures, they may be tempted and carried to fearful extravagancies. But they may be warrants for private persons in their doing of these things in an extreme necessity, to which at other times they are not called. And when the Lord, with whom is the residue of the Spirit, doth breathe upon his people more or fewer, to the exciting of more than ordinary zeal, for the execution of justice upon such adversaries, we should rather ascribe glory and praise to him whose hand is not shortened, but many times chooseth the weak and foolish things of the world to confound the mighty and the wise, than condemn his instruments for doing such things. Naphtali, pages 24 and 25, prior edition. All these cases, which are all I can think on at present, comprehending all that may at any way infer the guilt of murder, I have collected, to the end I may conclude this one argument, and leave it to be considered. If this extraordinary executing of judgment upon notorious incendiaries and murdering public enemies by private persons, in the circumstances above declared, cannot be reduced to any case that can infer the guilt of murder, then it cannot be condemned, but justified. But this extraordinary executing of judgment, etc., cannot be reduced to any case that can infer the guilt of murder, as will appear by the induction of all of them. Therefore, this extraordinary executing of judgment, etc., cannot be condemned, but justified. Number 2. In the next place, what we own may be done warrantably in taking away the life of men without breach of the 6th command, will appear by these propositions and assertions, which will bring the matter to the present circumstantial case. Firstly, it is certain, though the command be indefinitely expressed, it doth not prohibit all killing, but only that which is condemned in other explicatory commands. Our Lord Jesus, repeating this command, explains it by expressing it thus, Matthew 19, verse 18, quote, "Thou shalt not murder," unquote. And if any be lawful, it is granted by all. That is, which is unavoidable by the invincible necessity of providence, when a man following his duty doth that which beside and contrary his intention, and without any previous neglect or oversight in him, proveth the hurt and death of another, in which case he was allowed to flee to the city of refuge by the law of God. Whence, if that physical necessity did justify that kind of killing, shall not a moral necessity every way invincibly unavoidable, except we suffer ourselves and our brethren to be destroyed by beasts of prey, vindicate this kind in an extraordinary extremity, when the murderers are protected under the sconce of pretended authority? In which case the law of God should allow deliberate murderers in which case the law of God would allow deliberate murderers should be pursued by the avenger of blood, and not to have liberty to flee to these subterfuges and pretexts of authority, mere tyranny, but to be taken from the horns of such altars and be put to death, as Mr. Mitchell says in vindicating his own action, in a letter dated February of 1674.